All right, so basically imagine a race. We're running the hurdles, and basically we are starting from the finish line. We're going, and we reach our first hurdle, and we stumble over it. We fall over, we slide across the ground, and the hurdle kind of slides away and falls over. How ridiculous would it be if after we fell, we kind of sat up and turned around, sat where we were, and just looked at that hurdle and kind of contemplated on how much of a failure we were, or how much better we could have approached that hurdle, or what have you. And I think this passage in Philippians 3:12 through 16, Paul's kind of trying to paint a similar picture to that. He starts out in this passage in verse 12 and 13, says, "Not that I have already obtained it, or have already become perfect, but I press on so that I may lay hold of that for which also I was laid hold of by Christ Jesus. Brethren, I do not regard myself as having laid hold of it yet, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward to what lies ahead." But what is it that he keeps talking about? He says it a couple times in here, and we can kind of look back in verses 9 through 11 to find out really what he's talking about. Verse 9, he starts by saying that the righteousness from God that was given to him from God is based on faith. So he may know the power of the resurrection and being conformed to the death of Christ. So in 11, he says, all that, the righteousness that he has it so he may attain to the resurrection from the dead that Christ has achieved. So the it that he's referring to here is really the finish line that we have ahead of us, kind of our promise of the future of a place in heaven. So Paul points out here that this is obviously something that he hasn't achieved yet. He says right off the bat that kind of this promise of righteousness that God has for him, this isn't something he's already attained to, or that he's even become perfect. That word meaning mature. But what he has laid hold of, he says, is forgetting what lies behind him. And this is coming from Paul. It's very important to kind of recognize who's saying this. It's not some random guy who's never really experienced any traumatic suffering or done anything wrong or been righteous his whole entire life. But this is a guy who can look back to his past, and he was a persecutor of Christians. We can only imagine that when Stephen, the first Christian martyr, was stoned to death, he was the one that gave the order for that to happen. So he was the one who was inevitably holding the cloaks of the guys who were doing it. And he undoubtedly did this hundreds of times after that. But basically we can look at the analogy of that hurdle. We're running through these hurdles. It would also be just as crazy to look back at how we approached the starting line before we were even a Christian, before we even accepted what Christ had done for us on the cross. But he says here, instead of looking at those things, we should look to our future, look forward to what we have in heaven, and we can apply what God says about us. We can't be image bearers of God. We can't be image bearers of Christ. We can't do God's work if we're continually looking backwards. But if we hold on to what God says of us, if we forget what we've been forgiven, if we count as true that we are a new creation, Paul makes clear that we can do that we can really move forward and really strive through this race and see success and strive for the future. He also makes very clear that we can't do both. We can't be in a race looking forward towards the finish line, but at the same time looking back at our failings and our shortcomings. But he kind of continues on in verse 14. He says, pressing on towards the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. So Paul is encouraging us to continue to look forward like he has been so far in this passage, and namely to this prize that he's talking about in this verse of heaven. So basically, again, he's talking about this idea of what is true of us, our heavenly selves, and counting that as true of us now. To live in light of the fact that we will be in heaven. We have a place guaranteed for us there. Basically, having this eternal perspective, looking at this life, these 80 years or so, in light of the infinite amount of time afterwards. If we're looking at this timeline of this life that we have in front of us, these 80 years is a speck, and the rest of eternity is forever infinite after that. And when we look at that kind of timeline, what weighs more? What is more true of us? The shortcomings and the failings we experience in this life, or the suffering and the pain that we experience, or the perfection that we experience in heaven? And that's kind of what Paul's trying to get across. And he continues even more into verse 15. He says, "Let us therefore, as many as are perfect, have this attitude. And if in anything you have a different attitude, God will reveal it also to you." So the weird thing here is, we kind of talked about it earlier, but Paul goes from saying that not even he has attained this perfection to saying that as many as are perfect. But the word here, to kind of clear it up a little bit, is actually the Greek word teleoi, better translated mature. So he's talking about that this perspective on eternity, looking forward to what we have coming to us. That's a characteristic of a mature Christian, somebody who understands what's true of them, understands who God is in his character, and can use that as motivation. And he follows up that point, too, with the fact that that's something that God will reveal to us. So even if we do fall out of this mindset, God promises to show us the way, show us what's true of us, and he will also help us achieve that. But this is one of those things that, just like in John 15 says, apart from the vine, we can do nothing. Apart from Christ, we can do nothing. And this is no different. We have to trust that God's going to provide for that. We have to trust that he's going to be the one that's going to make that perfect in us. And he continues in verse 16 that, however, even though all those things are true, he says, let us keep living by that same standard by which we have attained. Paul closes this passage with a warning. He says, even though God will reveal that we have an active role in that, he's going to reveal that flawed attitude that we have, show us the way to get the right one, but we do have an active role. And we need to keep a watchful eye that we don't slip backwards. If we aren't striving forward, we're falling backwards. There's no standing still in the Christian life. We are either pursuing God, moving forward, growing closer to him, growing closer to other people, or we're falling backwards. We're losing ground. That's exactly what the enemy wants. He wants us to be focused on our shortcomings and focused on the ways that we've failed in the past before our race even began, and disqualify us from that. So in conclusion, Paul's really been doing attempting to really show us that in order to finish this race successfully, we need to be focusing on the finish line. We need to be focusing on, again, what is true of us eternally, and counting that as true of us now, that we are a new creation, and that the things that are in our past are not charged against us, and that we are no longer condemned for those, and we shouldn't be condemning ourselves for them either.